Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. In the late autumn of 1891, with the air turned crisp and the gas lamps of Baker Street casting long fingers of light across the fog-dampened windows, I found my companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, in one of his rare spells of silence. For 3 consecutive days he had spoken little, consumed only tea and shag tobacco, and pored over the same yellowed volume of Persian metaphysics without apparent progress or satisfaction. It was on the 4th morning, when even the clocks seemed reluctant to mark the hour, that our strange case began. The first indication came not with a knock, but a crash. A hansom cab, in clear violation of its usual decorum, came skidding to a halt outside 221B with such abruptness that Holmes himself looked up from his chair. A second later, the front door burst open, and Mrs. Hudson's voice, usually so even-tempered, rose in a fluster. "There's a gentleman here, sir," quite beside himself. Before she could finish, a man in an ink-stained morning coat and spectacles askew burst into the city. His hair was uncombed, his cuffs torn at one wrist, and though he was no older than 35, his eyes carried the feverish weight of some deep and recent horror. "Mr. Holmes, you must come at once. You must. It's Professor Elliot. He's vanished, right before our eyes." Holmes had risen, but his hands remained clasped behind his back. "You will forgive me," he said coolly, "but vanishing is not a scientifically sound means of exit. Begin again." The man caught his breath. "My name is Adrian Tolliver. I am a fellow at King's College, Cambridge, an assistant to Professor Rupert Elliot, chair of chronometric philosophy. At precisely 2:30 this morning, during one of our experiments, the professor lit a candle, nothing unusual, beeswax, from his usual drawer. But then he seemed to freeze, as though he were listening to something we could not hear. The air grew wrong, stifled, and then, yes, he disappeared. Not out the door, not up the stairs. One second he was seated at the table, and the next, nothing, gone. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Was the candle still burning? Tolliver blinked. "No," he said after a pause. "That's the strange part. The flame went out at the same instant, and the tabletop was scorched where the base of the candle had stood, a perfect black circle." Watson, despite himself, felt a prickling along the back of his neck. "Show me the candle," said Holmes. Tolliver hesitated. I brought it. Or, rather, what's left of it." From within his coat he withdrew a small box and placed it on the table with slow reverence. Holmes opened it. Inside lay a stub of wax, no longer than a child's finger. The wick was burnt and crooked, the base blackened. Beneath it, in the lining of the box, was a perfect scorched ring, as if the flame itself had imprinted time into the container. Holmes stared at it in silence. Then he took out his lens. "There are 3 drops of wax missing from the upper curve," he murmured, "but no evidence of melting. And the wick curiosity is doubled, not frayed, manufactured for prolonged and symmetrical burning. This is not a domestic candle." "Where was it purchased?" I don't know," said Tolliver. "It was in the professor's drawer, where he kept most of his ritual materials, incense, planetary charts, ancient texts. He was working on something he called a temporal locus. A way," he said, "to trap a moment, make time hold still." Holmes gave a quiet hum. "And what do your colleagues say?" Tolliver looked pale. "We sealed the room," the dean insisted. "The undergraduates are rattled. Some speak of spirits, others of time loops. There's even talk that Professor Elliot was taken by what they do not say." Holmes stood, and Scotland Yard. "They laughed. Said Elliot was probably on a drunken spree." Holmes turned to the window, where the morning fog still rolled sluggishly over the roofs of Marylebone. "Mr. Tolliver, you say the candle burned for less than a minute?" "Yes, perhaps 45 seconds, no more, and that was enough to burn a hole in time." Watson frowned. "Surely you don't mean that literally, Holmes?" Holmes turned. His eyes had gone distant the way they did when a case wormed its way past logic and into fascination. "I mean, Watson, only that this particular candle was meant to do something very precise, and that someone else knew what that was, long before Mr. Tolliver ever lit the match." He moved briskly to the mantel, pocketed his pipe, and snatched his coat from the rack. "We are going to Cambridge," he announced. "Pack quickly, Watson. I fear this is no ordinary disappearance. If Professor Elliot has, as our friend suggests, been removed from time, then I very much intend to bring him back. And if he is not," Holmes smiled faintly, Then I should like to know who would benefit from such a theatrical illusion, and how they pulled it off without leaving a single footprint behind. Outside, the wind had picked up. The candle stub lay silently in its box, and the ring of scorched wax seemed to pulse faintly against the fabric as if time itself had paused for breath. Chapter 2. A singularly curious object. By the time the train pulled into the station at Cambridge, the fog of London had given way to a wan grey sky and a biting wind that blew scattered leaves along the cobbled streets. Holmes disembarked with his usual speed, coat flapping behind him like a sail, and I followed, gripping my hat lest it fly clean off. Mr. Tolliver was already on the platform, pacing nervously in a threadbare overcoat that seemed a poor match for the sharpness of the air. Holmes greeted him with a nod. "You have the room secured?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes. No one has entered since I left. The dean agreed to keep the college's name out of any police report for the time being, but the faculty are growing restless, understandably." Holmes's voice held no judgment. "Take us there directly. The sooner we see the room, the sooner we may separate physics from theatre." We climbed into a waiting cab, and as the driver turned down narrow lanes toward the ancient stone quadrangle of King's College, Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet. His gloved hands were steepled before his mouth, eyes fixed on some unseen point beyond the window pane. "You find the matter strange?" I ventured. "Not strange, Watson. Puzzling. There is a difference. Strange implies madness or chaos. This," he shifted slightly, "this has the elegance of a riddle, a clockwork of misdirection." I was about to press him further when Tolliver leaned forward. "There's one more thing I didn't mention at Baker Street, because I wasn't sure. You see, not until I returned this morning." Holmes looked at him sharply. "Go on." Tolliver's voice dropped to a whisper. "The professor's journal is missing. He never let it leave his desk, but today gone." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Now that is more than strange." We arrived shortly thereafter at a long, oak-paneled corridor flanked by tall windows and lined with busts of long-dead scholars. Tolliver led us to a door at the far end, where a red wax seal still clung to the lock, cracked but unbroken. He produced a key and opened the door with a visible shiver. The room inside was dim, lit only by the pale glow of the afternoon filtering through leaded glass. Dust motes hung in the still air. At the center stood a long table littered with astronomical charts, a brass orrery, and several curious instruments whose purpose I could not guess. But my eye was drawn immediately to the scorched black circle in the table's center, its edges unnaturally clean, as if drawn by a draftsman's compass. Holmes moved without hesitation. He bent low, examined the mark, then ran a slender finger along the charred grain burned clean through the varnish. He murmured, "But no charring of the wood itself. A superficial burn. Then surface only." I knelt beside him. "And yet it smells metallic." "Precisely. Not wax, and certainly not beeswax." He straightened, eyes now roving over the room. "You said the candle was from this drawer?" "Yes," said Tolliver, hurrying to a roll-top desk. "Second one on the left." Holmes opened it and paused. "Do you mind, Watson?" I stepped over and looked inside. The drawer was filled with a curious assortment: sticks of incense, glass vials sealed with dark wax, slips of parchment covered in Greek, and what looked like Latin or perhaps something older. Most peculiar of all was a small tin labeled Etana. Lux. Holmes picked it up delicately and opened it. Inside were more candlesticks in oleage, the same pale ivory as the one Tolliver had brought, each ending in a twisted double wick. "Unusual," he said, almost to himself. "Very unusual." "Tolliver, do you know where these came from?" Tolliver shook his head. "No. The professor was very private about his acquisitions. He sometimes received parcels from abroad unmarked, always hand-delivered." Holmes raised the tin to his nose. "Rosemary, and something else. Myrrh, perhaps. An attempt to obscure a chemical scent, I think. And this box, look at the interior lining." He tipped it slightly toward me. There, just like in the other box, was a faint black ring scorched into the felt. Smaller, but identical in shape. Holmes's voice dropped. "Each candle, it seems, is designed to leave its mark." "But to what end?" I asked. "That is precisely what we must determine." He turned now to the bookshelves, scanning their contents with expert precision. "Chronometric philosophy," he said aloud, reading titles. "Temporal intervals, non-Euclidean sequence, a mind chasing the shape of time itself." He drew one slim volume down and flipped through it. Here, Tolliver, this passage refers to a theory of absolute loci, fixed coordinates in the temporal continuum. Eliot believed time could be spatially anchored, that it might, under the correct conditions, fold inward and be Tolliver paled. He said it was like a mirror, one polished just right. You could step into it, if only you found the seam. Holmes shut the book with a snap. Then, I believe, Mr. Tolliver, that your professor either found the side. Someone made certain he fell through it. At that moment, a knock came from the doorway. A man in a heavy robe and thick spectacles leaned in. Mr. Tolliver, apologies. The dean would like a word when you're able. There's growing concern. I'll come shortly, Tolliver said, clearly anxious to remain. Holmes handed him the tin of candles. Lock these away. And tell no one you still have them. Someone may be watching. Tolliver nodded and left, pulling the door gently shut. Behind him, Holmes turned to me then, and for the first time, I saw true intensity behind his calm. This is no mere academic folly, Watson, he said. Someone went to great lengths to make this disappearance appear supernatural, and yet no effect exists without cause. There is artifice here carefully veiled. And what now? Now, my friend, Holmes said, we speak to those who knew Professor Eliot best. Men lie, Watson, but time always tells the truth. Chapter 3, The First Clues, A Scene of Deception. Holmes had always insisted that the most revealing truths were often those left unspoken. And so, as we made our way across the quad to Professor Eliot's quarters, I noticed with growing unease how silent the college grounds had become. Students moved in hushed clusters. Curtains twitched at our passing. The disappearance of a respected professor, particularly one as eccentric and influential as Rupert Eliot, had clearly disturbed more than a few academic minds. We were met outside Eliot's rooms by a thin, hawk-nosed porter named Ames, who wore an expression of grave importance and suspicion in equal measure. His private chambers are just through there, sir, he said, unlocking a heavy oaken door. But I've strict orders. No one to touch the desk. Noted, Holmes replied mildly. The room inside was far less cluttered than the laboratory we had previously seen. It was appointed with dark furniture, a globe bar, an ornate writing desk of mahogany, and a single oil painting above the hearth, an abstract swirl of copper and deep blue, suggesting movement without form. Eliot's aesthetic, it seemed, leaned toward the esoteric. Holmes stepped in and immediately went to the window. He examined the latch, opened it, and leaned out, glancing at the narrow ledge that ran along the wall below. 30 feet to the ground, he murmured. No balcony, no ivy, no marks of a rope or harness. If the professor left through this window, it was either by force or illusion, or he didn't leave at all. I suggested. Holmes gave no reply. Instead, he crossed to the writing desk without touching it and studied its surface. He bent low, nose inches from the grain. There is a faint smear here, Watson, he said. Do you see it? Just beside the ink blotter. I moved closer. Sure enough, there was a pale, almost invisible, arc that caught the light at the right angle. Grease, I asked. No wax, and not from an ordinary candle. He stepped back. Ames, he called, who has been in this room since the professor disappeared? Only the dean and Mr. Tolliver, sir, and the porter who found the room empty the morning after. No cleaners. No one else. None, sir. Holmes nodded, then turned his gaze to a small bookshelf behind the desk. He ran a finger along the spines until one volume, a battered copy of On the Constellation of Time, caught his eye. He pulled it gently, and to my surprise, the entire bookcase shuddered, then clicked open by a hair's breadth. A false back, Holmes said softly, rather dramatic for a philosopher. He eased it open. Behind the row of books was a narrow recess, no deeper than a shoebox. Inside was a metal-cased brass, latched and engraved with the same swirling motif as the painting above the fireplace. Holmes lifted it delicately, set it on the desk, and opened it. Within lay 3 items: a leather-bound notebook, a glass vial containing a translucent powder, and a narrow strip of copper etched with mathematical symbols. Holmes lifted the notebook. First, this, I suspect, is the missing journal. He flipped through it carefully, scanning a page here, a scribbled margin there. His brow furrowed. Ah, here's something. If duration is a construct of perception, he writes, then its inversion must be achieved by deception. The eye must believe in stillness, even as time unravels behind it. Holmes turned another page, and here, the candle is the anchor, not the flame, but the structure. The geometry of the wick holds the key. Its double helix mirrors the sequence of progression. One thread forward, one backward. He looked up. A curious notion, Watson. A candle as a metaphysical gear in the clockwork of time. Surely he didn't believe he could actually alter time. Perhaps not in the vulgar sense, Holmes said. But if he believed the illusion was sufficient, that the mind could be tricked into perceiving time as reversible or static, then a sufficiently theatrical effect might accomplish that. He turned his attention now to the vial. The powder appears finely milled, not common salt or chalk, possibly silver nitrate. That would explain the burn mark we saw in the lab reactive, not thermal. Holmes carefully resealed the journal, and returned all 3 items to the brass case. Let's ensure this is stored with Tolliver's candles. We now have both the bait and the mechanism. Just then, a knock sounded at the open door. A young woman in a long brown coat and wire spectacles stood there, wringing her gloves. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Mr. Holmes?" I'm Ada Gleason. I was Professor Elliott's research assistant, until last week." Holmes gestured for her to enter. "I've just heard what happened," she said, voice tight. "They're saying he vanished into thin air." "They are, but I don't place much stock in thin air." She hesitated, then said, "You should know something. The week before I left, the professor received a letter. It unsettled him. I wasn't meant to see it, but I did." "What did it say?" She shook her head. "It was unsigned. Just the line, in Latin, fiat tenebrae in lumen temporis, let there be darkness in the light of time." Holmes's expression darkened. "You're certain of the phrasing?" "I memorized it. It felt threatening." "Did Eliot speak of enemies?" "Only obliquely. He once said that not all scholars believe time should be tampered with, that there were protectors of a sort." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Miss Gleason, would you be willing to write down everything you remember about that week?" "Yes, of course." "Good. Leave it with Mr. Tolliver, and keep your whereabouts private for now. This case may be deeper than even the professor suspected." After she departed, Holmes stood silently for a long moment. "What are you thinking?" I asked. "I am thinking," he said, "that someone very much wanted Eliot to stop asking questions, and that if we are not careful, we may be made to vanish next." Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects. The following morning broke, cold and clear. The mist of the previous days burned away by a sharp wind that rattled the ivy against the college walls. Holmes and I took a modest breakfast in the senior common room, joined briefly by Tolliver, who arrived with a list of names scribbled in a shaky hand. "These," he said, passing the paper across the table, "are the 4 individuals who had the closest dealings with Professor Eliot in his final week. Beyond myself and Miss Gleason, of course." Holmes studied the list. "The dean, naturally, Dr. Mallory." "Yes, he had several private meetings with the professor recently, though he claims they were merely administrative." "Then Mr. Calvert, philosophy." Tolliver nodded. "They co-authored several papers, but had a falling out over Eliot's, let us say, metaphysical detour, and the other 2, Miss Persephone Valley, doctoral candidate in comparative mysticism, very devoted to the professor, and finally, Dr. Silas Finch, physicist, publicly skeptical of Eliot's theories." But lately the 2 had resumed conversation. Holmes folded the paper neatly, a neat triangle of contradiction, rivalry, and loyalty. "I shall like to speak with each." Within the hour, we were ushered into the dean's study. Dr. Alistair Mallory was a tall, patrician man with iron-grey hair and a voice trained to command attention in the largest lecture hall. "I suppose you're here to determine whether Rupert's vanishing act was folly or farce," he said dryly, gesturing us to sit. Holmes did not return the smile. "I am here to determine what became of your colleague, Dean Mallory, and who, if anyone, wished him gone." The dean raised an eyebrow. "A bold suggestion. Not without warrant. You met with Professor Eliot 3 days before his disappearance." "I did." "What was the nature of that meeting?" Mallory sighed and folded his hands. Eliot had been petitioning the board to fund further development of his temporal locus hypothesis. He insisted he had reached a crucial turning point. I informed him, gently but firmly, that King's is a college of reason, not fantasy. Was there conflict? A heated discussion? Yes, but not unusual where Eliot was concerned. The man was brilliant, but increasingly erratic. Did he threaten to go elsewhere for funding? No. though I suspect he had private sources. His projects continued despite the board's refusal. Holmes regarded the Dean for a long moment. "Tell me, Dean, what would you say Elliot feared most?" Mallory blinked. "Failure." "No," Holmes said softly. "He feared being forgotten. And that makes for a dangerous kind of ambition." We left shortly thereafter and proceeded to the old stone wing where Dr. Ambrose Calvert kept his office. The philosopher greeted us with evident suspicion. He was a man of narrow frame and pinched expression, with ink-stained fingers and a perpetually furrowed brow. "Holmes," he said, as if the name itself tasted sour, "I suppose you believe Rupert was spirited away by his own intellect." "I believe he is missing," Holmes replied calmly, "and that some part of this college knows why." Calvert snorted. He was dabbling in nonsense. Temporal anchors, mirrored memory, metaphysical recursion, pure babble. He was trying to blend physics with philosophy and ended up poisoning both. "And yet," I said, "you published 3 joint papers years ago, when his mind still belonged to logic, before he started consulting astrologers and antique dealers." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Antique dealers?" Calvert shifted. "Yes, I believe he was purchasing obscure items, ritualistic nonsense, old clocks, bronze mirrors, even heaven help us candles imported from God knows where." Holmes stepped closer. "Did he ever show you these?" "No, but I heard Persephone Vale mention something called a mirror burner. Sounded like occult nonsense to me." "And Miss Vale, what was her role?" Calvert shrugged. "Elliot adored her intellect. She saw meaning in his ramblings. I suspect he saw something else." After a few more questions, we took our leave, and Holmes immediately turned us toward the college's west wing, where we found Miss Persephone Vale seated alone in a stone alcove, paging through a folio of illuminated manuscripts. She looked up as we approached, and I was struck by the strange serenity in her expression and otherworldly calm that did not quite match her youth. "Miss Vale," Holmes said, bowing slightly, "you were close to Professor Elliot." "I was his pupil," she said, "and I hope his friend." "Did he confide in you, of his work, his concerns?" She nodded. "More than most. He believed that time was less a line and more a pattern, that it could be altered not by force, but by intention. He believed memory was the thread." Holmes sat beside her. "And did he share his method?" "Not entirely, but he showed me something strange, a ring of copper, engraved with symbols. He said it was the key." "The key to what?" She smiled faintly. "To remembering the future." Holmes blinked. "And where is this ring now?" She hesitated. "I don't know. He kept it with his most private effects. It might be with his missing journal." "Miss Vale," Holmes said, voice low, "did the professor speak of being watched?" Her eyes widened. "Yes, he believed someone wanted to stop his research. He never said who, but he once told me that time was not only a mystery, it was jealous." With that cryptic remark still hanging in the air, we made our final stop. Dr. Silas Finch, the physicist, was a barrel-chested man with rolled shirt sleeves and hands stained with graphite. "Professor Elliot," he grunted, "brilliant man, mad as a barrel of frogs." "But you resumed contact with him," Holmes said. "I, out of respect and curiosity. He was trying to prove something no one else dared even question, that time could be localized." "You don't believe it?" "I believe in mathematics, and he had some, but he was missing a piece." "What piece?" Finch looked up, frowning. "Stability. You can't tinker with perception without some kind of anchor. Otherwise, you just drive men mad." Holmes stood. "Thank you, Dr. Finch. You've given us much to ponder." As we stepped out into the darkening quad, the wind catching at our coats, Holmes was silent for a long stretch. Then he said, almost to himself, "For brilliant minds, each circling the same flame, one drawn too close, one guarding secrets, one jealous, one skeptical, and a girl who believes you can remember the future." "And you?" I asked. "What do you believe?" Holmes looked up at the old clock tower. "I believe," he said, "that someone in this place has set time on fire and is hoping the smoke will blind us all." Chapter 5. First suspects. The red herring. By the next morning, whispers had turned to theories. Some claimed Professor Elliot had staged his own vanishing to test a theory or evade scandal. Others whispered darker possibilities, secret societies, failed rituals, or even a descent into madness. Through it all, Holmes remained curiously restrained, like a chess master observing the early phases of a complex endgame. We met Tolliver outside the college refectory. where he handed Holmes a folded note with shaking hands. "It was slipped under my door last night," he said. "No name, just this." Holmes read it aloud. "The mirror has cracked, but the smoke still curls. Beware the one who speaks backwards." He turned it over. No signature, no seal. Watson frowned. "A riddle, or a warning?" "Both," Holmes replied, pocketing the note. "Come, I wish to speak to the college constable." The man in question, a thick-set fellow named Greaves, met us in his office near the college gates. He had the air of one long resigned to strange behavior among scholars. "We've had disappearances before," Greaves said with a shrug. "Mostly undergraduates sneaking off to avoid exams. But this Elliot business, it's put people on edge." "You were first on the scene when Elliot was reported missing?" Holmes asked. "Second," Greaves replied. "First was the morning porter. Found Elliot's lab empty just after 6. Called me in. Door was locked from the inside. No broken windows, no footprints outside. Ground was wet, soft with rain. No signs of a struggle. None. Just the mark on the table, and one chair pulled back from the desk." Holmes leaned forward. "And the others? Staff, students? Has anyone been behaving unusually?" Greaves scratched his chin. "There's been talk about that girl, Miss Vale. They say she spent nights in Elliot's lab. Knew things no one else. Did the deans keeping a wary eye? Did anyone see her the night Elliot vanished?" Greaves shook his head. "Not a soul. But she didn't return to her rooms until after 3, and she won't say where she was." As we left the constable's office, Holmes murmured, "A curious thing. Watson, how a disappearance breeds certainty in shadows. The less known, the more imagined." We found Miss Vale in the chapel, seated alone in a pew, her fingers tracing a worn seam in the leather-bound Book of Common Prayer. "You believe I had something to do with it?" she said, without looking at us. "I believe," Holmes replied, "that secrets gather around the truth, like moss around stone. And you were guarding something." She turned to him, eyes hollow. He was frightened. "Mr. Holmes, the night before he vanished, he told me he'd made contact with what?" She hesitated. "Not what." When Holmes said nothing, he lit one of those candles in his study. He said the flame flickered in ways it shouldn't, that he heard something behind the silence like a voice through glass. And then the mirror cracked. "What mirror?" "The small bronze one. He kept it on his shelf, under a cloth. It wasn't there the next morning. Gone. Along with him." "Why didn't you report this?" "Because I thought maybe he'd succeeded, that he'd stepped into that other place, that if I said anything, they'd call me mad, or worse, that they'd try to bring him back and lose him completely." Holmes regarded her for a long, unreadable moment. "And the copper ring, the one you mentioned before, what became of it?" She paled. "I haven't seen it since that night. We left her shortly after, the chapel echoing with our retreating footsteps." Holmes was silent until we reached the quad. Then he said, "Her words are laden with myth, Watson. Mirrors, voices, flickering flames. And yet, I believe she is telling the truth, as she understands it." "You think she's guilty?" "No, but someone wants her to appear so. She is being framed by implication, guilt, without act." "Then who?" "Let us turn our attention to someone who benefits from confusion." That afternoon, Holmes requested another meeting with Dr. Ambrose Calvert. We found the philosopher in his office, poring over a manuscript with a red pen and a bottle of port open beside him. "Back again," he said, still chasing specters. "Holmes, I was hoping," Holmes said casually, "you might clarify a small point. You mentioned earlier that Elliot had acquired various curiosities, clocks, mirrors, candles. Do you know where he kept them?" "Why?" Calvert asked, looking to recreate his parlor tricks. Holmes's tone sharpened slightly. "Because one of those items, a small bronze mirror, is now missing, and because whoever removed it did so deliberately." Calvert laughed without humor. "I wouldn't know. I didn't frequent his study." "No," Holmes said, "but you knew his ideas intimately. You debated them publicly, and you stood to gain, did you not, from the academic space his absence created?" Calvert bristled. "Are you accusing me of murder?" "I am observing that your name has risen markedly in the faculty since Elliot's disappearance, that your recent paper in the Journal of Rationalism critiques his final theories line by line, something you could only have done had you seen that journal." "I never." Holmes raised a hand. "Spare the indignation. We will check the manuscript against Elliot's own. If you have copied from it, even in paraphrase, it will be obvious. And if the journal is in your possession, I suggest you return it before the authorities are summoned." Calvert's face turned a sallow shade of grey. "You'll find nothing," he said, almost inaudibly. Holmes gave a curt bow. "Then we have no quarrel." As we exited, I turned to Holmes in disbelief. "You think Calvert stole the journal?" "I think he had motive, proximity, and pride," Holmes said. "But that is not the same as guilt. He may have taken the journal to discredit Elliot, but I do not believe he made the man vanish." "Then who did?" "Ah, Watson, that is the question everyone is too eager to answer. We have not yet seen the truth, but we are beginning to see its outline." And with that, Holmes turned once more toward the library, the shadows of the ancient college stretching long behind him. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue, a Hidden Inconsistency. It was just past 5 when Holmes and I returned to Elliot's laboratory, the late October sun painting long coppery shadows across the stone floor. Holmes moved through the room like a cat retracing old steps, his gaze sweeping over the scene not with curiosity but with quiet expectation. As though the space itself owed him an answer it had not yet surrendered. He said nothing for some time. Then he turned, slowly, to face me. "Watson," he said, "let us assume for a moment that everything we've heard is true." Elliot lit the candle, murmured something to himself, and disappeared. "What, then, is missing from that picture?" I frowned. "We've established there was no forced entry, no broken window, no second exit. The candle left its mark. The mirror is gone. The journal stolen, but the wax stub remains, and yet... I paused. Holmes's eyes glittered. "Yes, there was no matchstick." Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely. No spent match in the ashtray, on the floor, nor on the table. A candle was lit, but by what? It's a minor absence, Watson, a detail any policeman would overlook. But it's that very omission that suggests the truth was arranged, the scene presented to convey illusion." He stepped back toward the table, drawing from his coat the candle stub we had been shown on our first day. "Consider this. The candle's base is singed, as though it sat atop flame, but candles do not burn downward. And yet the blackened ring matches perfectly." He held the stub up to the light. "Watson, what do you see in the wax?" I took it from him, turned it slowly in my hand. "A faint impression, 3 notches on the base." "Indeed. Now, examine the mark on the table." I knelt and peered closely. What I had taken for random singe marks now revealed a pattern indentations that matched the 3 notches. "It was mounted," I said, realization dawning. "This candle sat on something metallic, fixed." Holmes nodded. "More than fixed, engineered. The scorch ring was not the byproduct of fire. It was left by a heated element, perhaps chemically heated, perhaps something more arcane. But this, Watson, was no ordinary candle. It was a device, a focal point in an illusion crafted for a specific purpose." He stepped away and clasped his hands behind his back. "And now, we must consider why the mirror vanished." "You think it was taken?" I asked. "I think it was swapped," Holmes replied, "before the event, possibly by someone who knew the professor's habits, someone who wanted to ensure that, whatever happened, the illusion was complete. We left the laboratory with its silence intact and made our way back across the cloisters. As we passed through a grove of yellowing plane trees, we encountered Tolliver waiting near the sundial. He looked pale, strained. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I think I've done something foolish." "Go on." He glanced around before producing a sheet of parchment from his coat pocket. "I found this wedged behind the baseboard in Elliot's study. It's from his private journal. I should have brought it sooner. I didn't know what to make of it." Holmes unfolded the page with care. His eyes moved swiftly across the script, but I saw a flicker of tension tighten his jaw. He handed it to me without a word. The passage was brief. "The mirror is not the window. It is the door. The flame is the hinge. The wax the key. If the ring breaks, time closes. If it holds, one may pass through, but not return unchanged." Holmes looked to Tolliver. "Has anyone else seen this?" "No, sir." "Good. Keep it that way. And one more question, Mr. Tolliver. On the night of the disappearance, did you smell anything? Something ... chemical?" Tolliver paused. "Yes," he said slowly. "Like burning salt, metallic, sharp." Holmes turned away, and we followed him to a quiet corner near the courtyard's edge, beneath the arched shadow of an old bell tower. "What is it?" I asked. "A missing match," he said softly. "A mounted candle, a fabricated burn, And now, a scent. You've seen this before. I've seen its cousin. Years ago in Istanbul, a theater magician using magnesium salts to produce controlled flashes of light. In one performance, a man vanished in a puff of smoke. The trick relied on a false mirror and a chemical mist to distort perception. You think Elliot was tricked? No. I think someone used the trick to make us believe he was. Holmes's gaze drifted upward. And now we must ask, why go to such lengths to make Elliot disappear? Who benefits? Who feared what he might reveal? He turned to me abruptly. Watson, we must examine Dr. Finch's laboratory. Now. We found Finch alone, hunched over a workbench cluttered with tuning forks, wire coils, and open notebooks. He looked up as we entered. More questions, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Only a few, Holmes replied. Do you recognize this? He produced the candle stub and the scorched parchment. Finch studied both carefully. I've seen the symbol before, he said, pointing to a diagram on the journal, page a circular glyph, etched with loops and spires. Elliot believed it encoded a frequency, something resonant, like a tuning fork for consciousness. And the candle? Finch shrugged. Never saw that exact one, but he used similar ones in his anchor tests, claimed they centered the mind. I told him he was playing with suggestion. Holmes stepped to a cabinet nearby. May I be my guest? He opened it and there it was, a small brass base, blackened slightly at the rim, the same diameter as the candle, with 3 prongs, notches that would perfectly match the marks we'd seen. Holmes turned to Finch. You've seen this before. Finch nodded slowly. Yes, that's mine. I built it for him, as a favor, when about 3 weeks ago. And the mirror? Finch hesitated. I made that too, from bronze alloy. Used a vacuum mold to give it concavity, he said. It needed to be not quite reflective, called it a non-observer mirror. I thought it was nonsense. Holmes looked grave. And yet, you helped him. I was curious, Finch muttered. Besides, he paid well. Holmes closed the cabinet and straightened. Thank you, Doctor. That will be all for now. As we stepped back into the fading light of afternoon, I said, so Finch built the tools but didn't light the fuse. Perhaps, Holmes murmured, but I now believe this was not simply a disappearance, Watson. It was a performance, choreographed and executed. And, somewhere in the shadows of this college, the director is still watching the audience applaud. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The weather had turned again by the time we returned to our lodgings, clouds pressing low and thick, swallowing the late afternoon light into a premature twilight. Holmes stood at the hearth of our temporary quarters, one hand clasped behind his back, the other toying with a dried sprig of rosemary from Professor Elliot's laboratory. Watson, he said, eyes fixed on the flickering flames, I am beginning to think this case is not merely about vanishing, it is about transformation. Transformation, I echoed, glancing up from my notes. Indeed, whoever orchestrated Elliot's disappearance wanted it to appear not as a crime, but as an event to rupture in the fabric of understanding. Something too peculiar to be prosecuted, a mystery that would, in time, be accepted as unsolvable. That is the true danger here, not just the act, but its design. At that moment, a sharp knock came at the door. Holmes opened it to reveal a breathless Tolliver, his hat dripping with rain. There's been another development, he said. You must come, immediately. We followed him across the campus grounds, the wind snapping at our coats. He led us not to Elliot's laboratory, but to the archive annex behind the college library, a place rarely accessed, housing sealed materials, departmental records, and the more esoteric artifacts accumulated over centuries. It was Miss Vale who discovered it, Tolliver explained as we descended a narrow stairwell. She came here researching a passage. Elliot once quoted something about the light within time, and she noticed something strange in the archive ledger. He stopped before a large wooden door. When we opened the inner archive, we found this. He unlocked the door and stepped aside. The room within was dry and windowless, lined with shelves stacked floor to ceiling. But what drew our attention at once was the heavy reading table in the center and, what was upon it, a mirror, not large, perhaps 12 inches in diameter, framed in ornate brass, and cracked clean through the middle. A long spiderwebbing fracture divided the surface like a bolt of lightning captured mid-flash. Holmes moved forward as if approaching a relic. It's the mirror, Tolliver said, the one from Elliot's lab. It shouldn't be here. Who signed it in? Holmes asked. That's the strange part, Tolliver said. "No one. There's no entry in the ledger, and this door was locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry." Holmes examined the mirror without touching it. "Look here," he said softly. "There's something etched in the frame beneath the patina." I leaned in. The inscription was faint, nearly lost to time. "Nulla pars temporis est, sine lumen." No part of time is without light. I translated aloud. Holmes nodded. "And yet the mirror is broken, symbolically or deliberately." He circled the table once, then bent low to inspect the surface. "See this?" He said. "A burn mark similar to the one on Eliot's lab table. But this one is oval, not circular, and it's older, faded." He stood upright. "This mirror has been used before, Watson, perhaps long before Eliot. You think he was repeating someone else's experiment? I think he stumbled into a tradition, a pattern left behind like footprints through fog, and someone, perhaps even someone within these walls, ensured that he followed it exactly." We left the archive in silence, the implications trailing behind us like ghostly shadows. Later that evening, while Holmes busied himself analyzing a sample of the powder from Eliot's brass case, I stepped out for a breath of air and encountered Miss Vale near the cloisters, pacing beneath the lantern light with an unreadable expression. "Miss Vale," I said gently, "are you all right?" She stopped. "I'm not sure." "Do you believe in echoes, Dr. Watson?" "Echoes, not of sound, of actions, events that ripple backward and forward through time, as if something once done leaves a mark not only on the future, but the past." I hesitated. "Is that what you believe Eliot discovered?" "I believe," she said slowly, "that he opened a door, but not into the future, not exactly, into a moment. One single moment that loops endlessly until someone decides to step through." Her eyes gleamed in the low light. "I think he stepped through, and I think someone knew he would, because someone had done it before." I started to reply, but we were interrupted by a sudden shout from across the court. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." It was the porter, Ames, running toward us with a torch in hand. "There's been a break-in," he cried. "Dr. Finch's laboratory." We followed at once, Miss Vale close behind. When we arrived, the door to Finch's lab was ajar, the lock splintered and hanging from the frame. Inside, drawers were overturned, equipment cast across the floor, and papers scattered like chaff in a windstorm. But most concerning of all was the safe. It had been pried open. Dr. Finch stood nearby, livid and shaken. "I stepped out for half an hour," he stammered, "just to take some readings across the quad. When I returned this." Holmes stepped forward. "What was taken?" Finch hesitated, then said in a low voice, "Two things. One of the alloy mirror prototypes, and a box of wax-sealed vials." "What was in them?" I'm not entirely sure. A compound Eliot provided. He called it temporal resin, said it was chemically inert, but sensitive to electromagnetic pulse. We never tested it." Holmes scanned the wreckage, eyes alight. With grim understanding. "Someone needed the last pieces," he said, "and now they have them." He turned to me with sudden urgency. "Watson, we must secure Eliot's journal, immediately." "But you said it was hidden." "I did. But if someone knew about Finch's safe, they may know about the journal's hiding place as well. And that, Watson, would be the final key." Miss Vale stepped forward, her voice calm. "I know where it is." Holmes turned to her. "Why didn't you say so earlier?" "Because I wasn't sure until now." He left me a line in his notes: "Trust no mirror unless it faces west." I thought it poetic, but Eliot's study window faces west. "There's a false panel behind the bookcase." Holmes nodded. "Then we go now." As we crossed back through the campus under moonless sky, I could not shake the growing sense that we were no longer solving a disappearance, but interrupting something older, deeper, some ritual of mind and matter, long rehearsed, and the final act had already begun. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The corridor outside Professor Eliot's study was utterly silent when we arrived, so silent, in fact, that the tick of a hall clock somewhere above echoed like a hammer. The gaslights were dimmed to a faint glow, the shadows long and angular across the polished floorboards. Miss Vale led the way, her hands steady despite the tension I could feel rising in all of us. She paused before the door and looked to Holmes. "It hasn't been touched. I've checked twice this week." Holmes nodded once. "And the panel, behind the books on metaphysics, third shelf from the bottom." He built it himself. Holmes drew a small lamp from his coat pocket and lit it. The wick hissed, bathing the room in a steady, low light as we stepped inside. The study remained as we had left, unordered, untouched, almost austere. Yet under that stillness, I felt something strange, as though the room were holding its breath. Holmes moved with careful efficiency, making straight for the shelf Miss Vale had indicated. Without a word, he knelt and ran his fingers along the spines. "Here," he said. After a moment, he pressed inward, and with a faint click, a narrow panel swung open, revealing a small felt-lined recess no larger than a bread box. Inside sat a leather-bound volume, its corners worn but its lock intact. Holmes lifted it out with both hands, as reverently as if it were a sacred text. "The original journal," he murmured, "unedited, unaltered." He turned to Vale. "You were right to wait," she exhaled, barely audible. Holmes did not open the journal then. Instead, he returned it to his coat and said, "We examined this in private. No one else must know we found it, not until the right moment." He turned to Levant, then froze. "Watson," he said, his voice sharp, "do you smell it?" I paused and inhaled. "Yes, rosemary and iron." Miss Vale sniffed the air. "It wasn't here when we came in." Holmes's expression had gone very still. "Someone was here moments ago. We searched the study quickly, but found nothing, no open window, no unlocked drawer, no new disturbance. Yet the scent lingered, as if it clung to the very fabric of the air. "I do not like this," Holmes muttered. Back in our lodgings, Holmes placed the journal upon the table and, with gloved hands, undid the clasp. The pages within were yellowed and densely annotated, each line bursting with symbols, references, diagrams, and scattered fragments of Latin and Greek. "Fascinating," Holmes whispered. "Look here, Watson." He turned the book toward me, pointing to a passage underlined in crimson ink. "Time cannot be held in the hand. It is smoke. To capture smoke, you need a ring of fire and a mind willing to be burned." Another page described fixed moments and the notion of anchoring cognition to spatial memory, whatever that meant. Still another contained a precise sketch of the very candle we had seen, with notes describing its dual-braided wick, amber wax composition, and mirror burn coefficient. "The candle, the mirror, the ring," Holmes murmured. This was no idle philosophy. He was constructing something, a process. I leaned over the journal. "Do you understand it?" Holmes tapped the page. Enough to know the illusion was not merely theatrical. He was attempting to deceive the senses and, perhaps, briefly, the brain itself. And what does that suggest? That the disappearance may not have been physical at all. It may have been cognitive. He stood, abruptly, seized his coat, and turned to us. "We must return to the lab. I need to see the room again, but this time, not with my eyes alone." By the time we reached Elliot's laboratory once more, the night had turned icy. Frost glittered on the stone steps as we entered. Holmes moved quickly now, lighting a small spirit lamp and placing it on the center table. "I will conduct a controlled simulation," he said. "Tolliver, bring one of the remaining candles." Tolliver hesitated. "Is that wise?" "No, but it is necessary." The wax stub was placed precisely within the same brass mount Finch had built. Holmes adjusted the angle of the lamp until its flame lit the edges of the burn ring without setting anything alight. "I want you all to sit," he said, "and close your eyes for a moment. Breathe slowly. The air must be still." We obeyed, unsure of what exactly he intended. There was a long silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the spirit lamp. Then, Holmes whispered, "Now, ... open your eyes." I did, and for a moment, everything shimmered. The table seemed further away. The corners of the room bent slightly inward. Light wavered in concentric ripples, and for a fraction of a second, the mirror, though no longer present, seemed to exist again, hovering at the edge of vision. Tolliver gasped. Miss Vale closed her eyes tightly. I heard myself utter a quiet exclamation, and then, just as quickly, it was gone. The room returned to normal. Holmes stood perfectly still. "Well?" I asked, breathless. "It worked," he said. "Not fully, but enough. The distortion is neurological. Optical suggestion aided by heat, scent, and an engineered focal point. You're saying Elliot didn't disappear, he only seemed to." "Precisely. To everyone watching, he vanished. But in truth, he slipped behind the illusion, perhaps even behind the mirror." "But that means," Holmes nodded, "he may still be here, somewhere close, hidden." We stood in silence, the implications too vast to grasp all at once. Holmes turned away, back to the journal. "There's more in here," Clues, instructions, I'll need the night to decipher it. But what of the one behind this? I asked. If Elliot created the illusion, who turned it into a disappearance? Holmes looked up at me. For the first time, I saw something behind his usual calm. Fear. Someone who understood the trick and completed it, he said. Someone who wanted Elliot gone, and who now knows. We're beginning to see. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The next morning dawned with a bitter chill. Frost lacing the glass panes and silvering the rooftops of the old college. I found Holmes already awake, standing at the window of our lodgings, with the professor's journal in hand, his breakfast untouched, and the fire long gone cold. He was still in his shirtsleeves, unmoving, his brow furrowed in an intensity I had seen only in the darkest depths of our most confounding cases. There's something missing, he murmured without turning. A step, a break in the pattern. The ritual was precise. Watson too precise. Elliot may have believed he was the architect of the illusion, but someone else choreographed the finale. Before I could respond, a loud rap came at the door. Tolliver burst in, wild-eyed, his breath misting in the cold air. There's been another incident, he said, this time in the north wing. Holmes was already pulling on his coat. Who? He asked. Miss Vale, Tolliver said grimly. She's alive, but barely. We reached the college infirmary within minutes. Miss Vale lay in a narrow bed, her face ashen, a bruise forming along her temple. A nurse gave way as we entered, whispering, concussion. She was found at the base of the west stairwell. No witnesses. Said she was pushed. Holmes stepped closer, examining her injuries with clinical precision. Her eyes fluttered open as we approached, then widened in sudden recognition and fear. Did you see who did it? Holmes asked softly. She nodded, then shook her head, confused. I didn't see the face, but the voice. It was familiar. Male or female? Male. Anything else? She tried to rise but winced with pain. He said one thing, just before he pushed me. Holmes leaned in. What did he say? She closed her eyes, voice trembling. The mirror must remain broken. Holmes was still for a long moment. Then he turned to me. This confirms it. Someone is escalating. Miss Vale got too close. Too close to what? To the truth or to the journal? Perhaps both. Back at our quarters, Holmes paced like a man possessed. The journal opened across 3 pages on the writing table, his fingers darting from diagram to note to margin. There is a hidden logic to it all, he muttered. This isn't madness. It's theater. Science masquerading as mysticism. The mirror, the ring, the double wickage was a tool, but none of them worked alone. He paused suddenly. What's in Finch's vials? The temporal resin. If someone now holds a mirror, a candle, and the resin, they can replicate the entire effect. You think they're planning another disappearance? Not planning, attempting. Last night was not about Miss Vale. It was about her silence. Someone wanted her out of the way before she revealed the journal's hiding place. She survived, but barely. He turned the journal toward me again, tapping a new diagram. It resembled the layout of Elliot's lab, down to the position of the table, the chair, and a mirror mounted at a precise 45-degree angle. This, Holmes said, is not just instruction, it's a map, a ritualized stage. I frowned. But then why Elliot? Why now? Because, Holmes said quietly, he was the only one willing to believe it could be done, and someone else was willing to let him believe, so long as it ended in his erasure. He stepped back from the journal and looked at me squarely. There will be another attempt. Soon the pattern demands it. That afternoon, we set out again across the grounds, Holmes moving with silent urgency. We checked the laboratory. It was untouched. The archives, likewise undisturbed. But as we turned into the northern cloister, we heard footsteps echoing rapidly from the east corridor. Ames, the porter, came into view, his face flushed with panic. They've broken into the observatory, he gasped. 3rd floor, locked door, glass smashed. Holmes did not wait for explanation. He bolted up the staircase 2 steps at a time. I closed behind, our breath clouding in the frigid air. The observatory was dark when we arrived, save for the faint light of a single oil lamp burning low in the corner. Shards of glass crunched underfoot. The telescope had been knocked askew, and one of the dome's shutters had been wrenched open, letting the cold sweep through the chamber like a spectre. In the center of the floor was a ring, a perfect black circle, roughly 2 feet in diameter, scorched into the stone tiles. Holmes froze. No candle stub, he said. No brass mount, but the mark is identical. They rehearsed it here. He turned to me. This was a dry run, Watson. A practice stage. They're preparing for a final performance, and who? Holmes knelt by the burn ring. Someone with access. Someone who knows where the shadows fall. Someone we've already spoken to but who has told us only fragments. He stood abruptly. We returned to Finch. Now, Dr. Silas Finch greeted us in his workshop with less bravado than before. The wreckage of the previous break-in had not been fully cleared, and his manner was anxious, eyes darting between the broken shelves and the door behind us. "I've told the constable everything," he said. "The mirror, the resin, the designs, I swear. I have nothing left to hide." "Then you'll understand our concern," Holmes replied coolly. "Miss Vale was nearly killed this morning. A second ritual site has been discovered in the observatory, and your tools continue to appear at the center of each incident." "I didn't do this," Finch said sharply. "Why would I?" Elliot's theories were laughable to me. Holmes took a slow step forward. "No, Doctor. They frightened you, because you understood just enough to realize that someone else could make them work." He reached into his coat and removed a page torn from the journal, the diagram of the observatory configuration. "Have you seen this before?" Finch's face drained of color. "Yes," he whispered when, a month ago, he showed it to me in confidence, said it was an experiment in inversion of temporal direction. I told him it was nonsense. Dangerous, we argued. And after that, Finch lowered his eyes. He stopped coming. I assumed he'd moved on. Holmes studied him for a long moment. "Then tell me one thing truthfully, Dr. Finch. If you wished to replicate this illusion today with the materials you built, how long would it take?" Finch hesitated. "An hour, maybe less." Holmes's voice dropped. "Then we haven't a moment to lose." We left the workshop as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the college fell into that eerie quiet that precedes some great attention, the air before a storm or the silence before a scream. Holmes turned to me as we crossed the quad. "The culprit has everything they need. The materials, the knowledge, and the performance space. There will be no third rehearsal. And the target." Holmes didn't answer at first. Then, softly, "It's not Elliot anymore, Watson." "Then who?" He looked me dead in the eye. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. Evening deepened into night, with an unnerving swiftness. The wind had returned sharper now, tugging at the lanterns outside the hall, and rattling the leaded windows of the old college buildings. Holmes moved through the courtyard like a shadow among shadows, silent, focused, his steps guided more by deduction than instinct. "It's almost theatrical, Watson," he said as we neared the library cloisters. "A carefully rehearsed progression. First, the illusion, then the missing body, then the replication, and no an audience. You believe the real attempt is imminent. I'm certain of it. The performance must be completed. The audience must be shown something inexplicable. And this time, they mean for me to be the spectacle. And why you? Because I've broken their pattern. I've read the journal. I've seen through the deceit. And now, I must be removed dramatically, completely." He stopped at the threshold of the cloister. "But the question, Watson, is why? Why go to such lengths to silence a philosopher? Why cloak a crime in ritual and illusion, unless what was being concealed was far more dangerous than it appeared?" He turned to me, eyes alight. "The answer lies not in Elliot's disappearance, but in his return." I blinked. "Return?" Holmes nodded. "What if the point was never to make him disappear but to ensure no one wanted him found? That his absence became not a mystery but a legend? That no one dared go looking because they believed he had crossed some threshold best left sealed?" Before I could reply, a soft knock echoed behind us. It was Tolliver. "I've just come from the physics department," he said, breath hitching. "Someone broke into the old lecture theater, left a note pinned to the blackboard." He handed it to Holmes. It was written in ink, shaky but deliberate. "Tonight, the mirror turns again. At the stroke of 11, the fire will burn backward, and time will devour the questioner." Holmes folded the note and placed it in his coat. "The theater, of course," he said softly. "The largest stage in the college. The best vantage point for a final act." We reached the old lecture theater just before 10. The room was dark save for a few guttering lamps along the upper gallery. Tiered seats rose in concentric rows around the central floor, where a blackboard, a raised platform, and several brass stands remained from the department's former demonstrations. At the center of the floor, lit from beneath by a curious amber glow, stood a familiar configuration. A brass mirror, new, uncracked, angled precisely 45 degrees, a shallow copper ring mounted in the floor, empty but faintly scorched, a stand holding a stub of candle, identical to those we had seen before, its wick braided into a double helix, and beside it, a notebook open to a page inked in crimson. Holmes stepped forward without hesitation. "They've prepared everything. The geometry is perfect. The angle of the mirror, the placement of the flame. Even the scent in the air, rosemary again, tinged with something acrid. I scanned the darkened corners of the theater. Do you think the culprit is watching? They want me to step into the circle," Holmes said calmly, "to perform the ritual. They expect my curiosity will overcome caution, and will it?" Holmes turned to me with a glint in his eye. "No, Watson, because I've rewritten the script." He pulled from his coat a small glass vial identical to those from Finch's lab and placed it carefully in the base of the candle's brass mount. "Resin?" I asked. "Water," he replied. "Distilled, harmless. The illusion will fail, but convincingly enough to tempt the real culprit into action." He stood and turned to Tolliver. "Take your place behind the curtain. Watch for movement in the wings. They'll want to confirm I've followed the steps. And me, I asked you, my friend, will observe the audience." I frowned. Holmes gestured to the gallery seats above. "They'll come to see the trick. Curiosity will pull them, but one of them will not be curious. They will be certain wait and not for a result, but a vanishing. That is our perpetrator." As the final minutes ticked toward the hour, a hush settled over the room. Holmes took his place in the center of the ring, the notebook in one hand, the unlit candle before him. 11 o'clock struck. He lit the wick at once. The room shifted, a subtle warping in the light. The mirror shimmered, then trembled. The shadows bent inward. Gasps echoed from the darkness above, as several onlookers, faculty, students, even a few porters had gathered without our knowing. I could see their faces pale in the low light, eyes wide with fear. The mirror began to pulse, catching the flickering flame and reflecting it outward like a signal. And then Holmes extinguished the candle with a sudden motion. The room snapped back to stillness. Silence fell. He stood perfectly still, then turned slowly. "I remain," he said clearly, "unvanished." The crowd began to murmur, some visibly disoriented, others deeply shaken. Holmes scanned the gallery with narrowed eyes. "There," he said suddenly. "Third row, left aisle." I followed his gaze. A figure had risen and turned to flee, emerged from the shadows at the wing and intercepted him. Before he could reach the doors, Holmes and I climbed quickly to the gallery. The man struggled, but it was brief. In the light, his face was unmistakable. "Dr. Ambrose Calvert," Holmes said coldly. The philosopher was pale, sweat glistening at his brow. "You followed every step," Holmes continued. "You recreated every condition, but you overlooked one thing." Calvert sneered. "What?" "The mind must want to be deceived." He handed the notebook to me and turned back to the trembling man. "You murdered Elliot in spirit, if not in flesh. You designed a disappearance not to remove him, but to discredit him forever, so no one would read his work, so no one would listen. You built a myth around his madness and watched it grow." Calvert laughed bitterly. He would have unmade everything: logic, reason, the hierarchy of time. His theories were poison, seductive poison. "I did what I had to." Holmes nodded. "So did I." As Tolliver escorted Calvert down the steps and out into the waiting hands of college authorities, Holmes remained standing in the gallery, gazing down at the mirror, the candle, and the empty ring on the floor. "He made you believe time could bend," I said. "He did more than that," Holmes replied. "He made someone believe it shouldn't, and somewhere, perhaps in time, perhaps only in memory." Mirror cracked again. Chapter 11. The bait. Holmes' grand strategy. The arrest of Dr. Ambrose Calvert was not, as I had naively believed, the conclusion of the matter. No sooner had he been taken into custody than Holmes turned to me with that unmistakable gleam in his eye, that look which meant the game, though advanced, was not yet over. "You saw how quickly he broke, Watson," Holmes said as we walked back across the quad beneath a dark, moonless sky. "That wasn't the confession of a criminal mastermind. That was a man cornered with only half a story to tell." "You think he wasn't acting alone?" Holmes stopped beside the fountain at the center of the courtyard, its waters frozen in stillness. "I think he was an ideologue, not a strategist. a man who believed Eliot's theories were a danger to intellectual order. But someone else, someone more calculating, used him. The ritual, the mirror, the replicated settings, those required more than loathing. They required planning. Then who? Holmes was quiet for a moment, gazing at the stars overhead. There is one name we've heard too little from, a name that floats around the edges of the story but never quite takes center stage. Finch, I guessed. Holmes shook his head. No, Mallory, the dean. I blinked. But he's the one who denied Eliot funding. He dismissed the theories exactly too quickly, too publicly. He moved to control the narrative before it even began. I was silent, watching Holmes think. The wind curled through the cloisters, carrying with it a faint scent of rosemary and coldstone. So what do we do? I asked. Holmes turned back toward our lodgings, his coat catching the wind like a sail. We give him what he wants, he said. One last illusion, one final bait. By morning, word of Calvert's confession had spread across the college. The faculty gathered like crows around a battlefield, some vindicated, some scandalized, and many merely curious. The dean himself, Dr. Alistair Mallory, made a formal statement to the council, declaring the matter a grave aberration in academic judgment and urging all parties to respect the sanctity of inquiry, even in the face of madness. It was the kind of elegant speech that always accompanied the quiet burial of a scandal. Holmes remained seated in the gallery of the council chamber, fingers steepled, gaze unreadable, as the members filed out. Mallory lingered at the lectern, conversing softly with a senior fellow. Holmes rose and made his way down the aisle. I should like a word, Dean, he said smoothly. But Mallory turned. Mr. Holmes, I understand your efforts have led to an arrest. Congratulations are in order. Holmes smiled faintly. And yet you look displeased. I'm concerned. Of course, a college's name is its currency. I trust the matter will be concluded soon. Holmes paused. Soon, yes. Though one last piece remains. Mallory raised an eyebrow. Oh, Holmes stepped closer. The journal was recovered. Eliot's original. In it, he names one final collaborator, someone who reviewed his diagrams, offered critiques, even suggested alternative configurations for the mirror angle and the resin composition. Mallory's face twitched just slightly. A fabrication, no doubt. I thought so too, Holmes said, until I tested one of those configurations myself. It works brilliantly. Mallory swallowed. I'd like to invite you to a private demonstration, Holmes continued. Tonight. The original setup. I've reconstructed everything. With the real resin. This time. Mallory hesitated too long. Then he nodded. How very ... generous. Holmes offered a bow. I thought you'd appreciate closure. That night, the lecture theatre was quiet once more. Holmes arranged the setting precisely as before. Mirror, candle, resin, angle, and room temperature all accounted for. I stood in the shadows of the gallery, watching. Mallory arrived exactly at the appointed hour, dressed impeccably, his posture that of a man accustomed to controlling every conversation. Mr. Holmes, he said, surveying the room. So this is the theatre of madness. Holmes smiled politely. Tonight, perhaps clarity instead. He gestured toward the central platform. If you'll observe from the second row, that seat offers the best vantage for the optical alignment. Mallory obliged, settling into the seat as Holmes lit the candle and stepped into the ring. He began softly. In Eliot's theory, time was not a river but a spiral. One could, by recreating precise conditions, re-enter a moment not to change it, but to witness it anew. That was his dream. To look backward with the clarity of forward thought. The mirror shimmered. The flame danced. And so, Holmes continued, he built this device not to cross time, but to fool the mind into believing it had done so. He extinguished the candle. Mallory sat frozen, and asked, voice dry. Holmes walked forward slowly, lowering his voice, and it worked, but not alone. It needed fear, belief, and a hand to guide the illusion. He stopped beside Mallory, guided that hand. Mallory did not move. You knew Eliot's theories. You funded the early models through back channels. And when he drew too close, when he proposed publishing, you turned to Calvert. Mallory's jaw clenched. Eliot was a danger to academic coherence, he said at last. He would have undone centuries of scholarship with a dream, a trick of perception. I couldn't allow it. So you turned his theory into a myth, Holmes said. A disappearance, a madness. I made it untouchable. Holmes nodded slowly. But you made a mistake. Mallory frowned. You assumed Elliot was lost, that the trick removed him. But he wasn't gone. He was hidden, in his own mind. Perhaps a fugue, a fracture. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a sheet of parchment. It was Elliot's final entry, recovered from the back of the journal. If they come for me, I will remain. In the mirrored edge, between seconds, awaiting clarity, Holmes turned. We found him, alive, disoriented, but conscious. Mallory's mask cracked. You're lying. Holmes smiled. Before another word could be spoken, two constables stepped from the rear of the room. You're under arrest, one said calmly. Charges include conspiracy, destruction of property, and attempted murder. Mallory slumped, the weight of revelation breaking something in him as they led him away. Holmes blew out the candle. Not every mirror lies, he said softly. Only those placed by cowards. Back in our lodgings, the fire crackled warmly. Holmes sat once more with Elliot's journal open before him, a look of deep contemplation clouding his features. You said Elliot was alive, I said, but you never showed him. Holmes closed the journal, because he isn't. I lied. I stared at him. He died the night of the experiment. A seizure brought on by shock, according to the coroner. But the illusion remained. And so did the myth. He rose. I needed Mallory to believe the door might still open. That was the only bait he'd follow. And what now? I asked. Holmes looked into the fire. Now we let the mirror rest, and close the ring for good. Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. The following morning was a still and bitter one. A frost had settled across the Cambridge lawns, painting the blades of grass in spectral silver. From the window of our temporary lodgings, I watched the students move slowly through the mist, heads down, voices hushed. The once familiar grounds now steeped in the residue of illusion, deception, and something eerily close to awe. Holmes, as ever, rose early, but he had not spoken since Mallory's arrest. The night before, he stood now at the hearth, unmoving, his eyes not on the fire, but on the pages of Professor Elliot's journal, spread across the mantel in carefully fanned layers. It struck me that he was not so much reading them as listening to them. I've been wrong before, Watson, he said at last. But rarely have I been so nearly wrong. In what way? I asked. In assuming that the performance ended with Mallory, that the illusion was designed for a single audience. He tapped a finger on the journal's final page. But what if it wasn't? What if the entire structure from candle to mirror, from disappearance to confession, was intended to fool not just the victim, not just the witnesses, but me? You believe Mallory was set up? No, Mallory was guilty, without question. But I suspect now he was not the originator of the scheme. He reacted to the illusion, yes, but the design, the blueprint, that came from a subtler hand. He pulled the final journal page free and held it up to the window. Look here, he said. This ink, it's not the same as the rest. Slightly faded, as though it had been written weeks earlier. The hand is Elliot's, but the pressure is different. And the phrasing, if they come for me, I will remain. Between seconds, that is not a final thought. That is a planted idea. He turned to me, his voice lower now. Watson, we have assumed all along that Elliot's disappearance was the core of the mystery. But what if his absence was the solution? I frowned. I don't follow. Holmes returned to the mantel. Let us walk the line again. Elliot performs an experiment. He disappears. His closest allies, Tulliver, Vale, Finchall, report fragments. Mallory escalates to conceal what he believes is a truth too dangerous. And Calvert, desperate to preserve his position, turns conspiracy into spectacle. Each acting independently, I said. Holmes nodded. Each convinced they were the only ones who understood what Elliot was. But what if none of them truly did? He moved to his coat and drew from the inner pocket a thin strip of copper etched with those same cryptic symbols we had seen before. I found this, he said, wedged behind the baseboard of Elliot's lab during our first visit. At the time, I thought it merely a prototype. He held it up now. But it is not. This, Watson, is the key. Not metaphorically. Literally, I took it from him. The copper was warm, almost humming in my palm. Faintly, it bore the ring-shaped diagram repeated in the journal. Over and over a loop intersected by an arrow, pointing not forward, not backward, but inward. Holmes watched me carefully. I ran a spectrographic test this morning, he said. Traces of silver nitrate, and beneath that, a faint oil frankincense, common in certain religious rituals. Yes, but also, A preservative. For what? He stepped forward. For memory. The design is not just chemical, it's conceptual. The ring was meant to induce a fixed perception loop in the mind, replaying a singular moment, and if introduced carefully through scent, light, and geometry, it could simulate not disappearance, but return. Return of what? Or whom? He said softly, and at that precise moment, a knock came at the door. Tolliver stood there, hat in hand, visibly shaken. I just saw him. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Who? Tolliver swallowed hard. Professor Elliot. We followed him across the grounds, through a side gate, and down a narrow passage flanked by ivy-covered walls. It was a forgotten corner of the college, unused since before the war. The stone chapel that awaited us was crumbling, its stained glass long removed and its pews now little more than skeletons of wood and rot. Inside. Near the pulpit, stood a figure. At first I thought it a vagrant, hunched and cloaked, his face obscured by the fall of a long grey hood. But then he turned and I recognized, unmistakably, the sharp cheekbones and deep-set eyes of Rupert Elliot. He looked thinner, older, but it was him. Rupert? Tolliver asked, voice cracking. Elliot blinked slowly, as if struggling through fog. Time is wrong, he whispered. It stutters. Holmes stepped forward. How long have you been here? I don't know. I was inside the ring. It kept folding. I wasn't dead, but I wasn't out. Holmes looked to me. The illusion didn't kill him, it trapped him. The mind was bound to a loop, a self-sustaining echo. He escaped only because the structure broke. Elliot nodded slowly, as if hearing. Through a wall, I thought. I was watching the stars. But they weren't stars. They were moments. Every memory, every regret, played back forever. Holmes offered him a seat on a broken pew. Someone placed the key, he said gently, and someone else closed the door. Elliot's eyes cleared just a little. Mallory didn't build the trap, he said. He only locked it. Then who built it? I asked. Elliot looked past me. Asked the one who never questioned it. We turned. Tolliver stood frozen, pale. I didn't mean to, he said softly. I believed in it. I believed it could work. But Elliot was losing clarity. He wanted to publish before it was safe. I thought if I could stop him, delay him just long enough to understand it myself. You placed the mirror, Holmes said. Swapped the resin, hid the journal. Tolliver nodded. I didn't mean for him to vanish, only pause. But it kept going. Elliot, now trembling, whispered, it kept going, and I couldn't find the door. Holmes closed his eyes. The moment of recognition, he said, is never in the act. It is in the echo. He turned to me. We now have every piece, Watson. What remains is only to place them where all can see. And behind us, in the ruin of the chapel, the morning sun broke through a fractured window pane, casting light in a perfect ring around Rupert Elliot's feet. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. In the hours following the rediscovery of Professor Elliot, the atmosphere across the college shifted subtly but unmistakably from suspense to discomfort, from curiosity to dread. The tale that had begun as a whispered enigma had become something else entirely, a confrontation with belief itself. Elliot was not a ghost or a martyr. He was very much alive and very much broken. Holmes had Elliot taken to the college infirmary under guarded care, but not before the professor, in a moment of uncanny lucidity, whispered a final word to Holmes alone. Whatever it was, Holmes spoke of it to no one. We returned to our lodgings that afternoon to find the fire out, the coals dead and cold. Holmes sat in the armchair for several minutes, fingers drumming soundlessly on the arms, before finally rising. It is nearly complete, Watson, he said. The ring has closed, the curtain fallen, but like any illusionist's trick, there remains the final flourish at the escape. Escape, I echoed. Holmes moved to the window, parting the curtain just enough to peer out at the fog-cloaked campus. Tolliver is not done, but he confessed, only half. Holmes cut in. He confessed to placing the mirror, to hiding the journal, but not to the second ritual, the lecture theatre. Yes, that was not for Mallory. That was meant for me. Tolliver laid the groundwork under Calvert's watch, then let Calvert's guilt bloom into action. It was elegant, symmetrical. It would have been perfect if, not for one thing. Holmes turned to me now, his gaze sharp. He didn't expect Elliot to return. At Holmes's instruction, I joined him later that evening outside the library. Archives. The night was colder than the last, the frost now creeping down the stone walls like ivy made of glass. Holmes had summoned Tolliver under the pretense of assisting in securing the remaining journal fragments. The young man arrived promptly, carrying a canvas satchel. "Thank you for coming," Holmes said calmly. "There's one final page we believe may have been misfiled under anonymous contributions, likely catalogued in the restricted section." Tolliver nodded. "Of course, I know the system." The archives were empty save for a single lamplight flickering at the far end. We descended the narrow stairs once more into the lower vaults, past the locked cabinets, past the sealed shelves, until we reached the far alcove beneath the western wall. Holmes gestured to a cabinet marked Special Access, Occult Geometry. "Here," he said. "Could you?" Tolliver produced a key without hesitation. That, in itself, was telling. Inside were no more than 6 volumes. Holmes scanned them briefly, then stepped back and let Tolliver lean in. As the young man did, Holmes spoke quiet, clear, and final. "You rehearsed it here, didn't you?" Tolliver froze. The observatory was too public. "But this space, these angles is perfect. You even tested the scent sequence. A touch of rosemary, just enough myrrh. You prepared every detail for the third and final act." Tolliver did not move, and it would have worked, Holmes continued, if Elliot had remained lost, if the illusion had held. But he returned, and with imure design began to fray. Finally, Tolliver turned. His face was pale, drawn. "Only wanted to understand," he said. "Elliot was always just beyond my grasp. His thoughts danced at the edge of language. But I knew if I could trace his steps exactly, I could follow him." Holmes nodded. "And when he hesitated, when he grew cautious, you decided to finish the work yourself." "He was the work," Tolliver whispered. "He is the proof." But no one believed him. Not Mallory, not Calvert, not even Finch. Holmes took a step closer. "So you built a myth, a disappearance, a legacy. You made Elliot immortal not in scholarship, but in story. But you didn't plan for return. You didn't plan for survivors." Tolliver's breath caught. "I can still fix it." "You cannot," Holmes said flatly. Tolliver reached into his coat. Holmes was faster. With one swift motion, he seized the young man's wrist and twisted it away. A brass mirror, polished, small, and etched with symbols, fell to the stone floor and cracked clean down the center. Tolliver collapsed to his knees beside it. "I wasn't going to hurt anyone," he muttered. "You were going to vanish yourself," Holmes said coldly. "One last performance, to complete the legend, and this time, be the legend." Tolliver didn't deny it. I bent and picked up the shattered mirror. "No resin," I said, because he wasn't trying to deceive others. Holmes replied, "Only himself." Later that night, after Tolliver had been turned over to the authorities and the brass mirror stored among the case evidence, Holmes and I returned once more to Elliot's room at the infirmary. The professor lay asleep, his face peaceful in the soft candlelight. Holmes placed something on the table beside the bed, a small copper ring, the one from Elliot's lab, cleaned, polished, whole. "He may never speak clearly again," Holmes murmured, "but I believe he will remember. Not the illusion, not the trap, but the moment, the first moment he believed he had touched something eternal." He turned to leave. As we stepped into the quiet corridor beyond, I asked, "Do you believe that, Holmes? That time can be bent, that memory can become a place?" Holmes didn't answer at first. Then he said, "I believe that when a mind is made to believe strongly enough in a pattern, it will find that pattern anywhere, even in silence, even in shadows." He paused by the stairwell. "And I believe that Rupert Elliot touched something very old. Not time, perhaps, but story. And someone else tried to twist that story into control." We stood in silence for a long moment. Then Holmes smiled faintly. "And we turned the page back." Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed the next morning brought with it a cleansing rain. It fell in a steady, whispering rhythm against the windows of our lodgings, washing the frost from the rooftops and drawing long ribbons through the soot of the college eaves. Though the case appeared, on its surface, concluded, Mallory arrested, Calvert disgraced, Tolliver in custody, Holmes showed no signs of release. He sat at the table, Elliot's journal open once more before him, flipping pages with careful precision. His pipe lay forgotten, his tea sat cold. The fire, which I had lit myself hours earlier, had gone down to a low bed of embers. I watched him in silence, sensing that some inner wheel continued to turn a gear that refused to settle into place. You've already unraveled it, I said. What more is there to find? He didn't look up. Only the thread beneath the thread. Watson. Meaning. Holmes finally turned his gaze toward me. Meaning we have identified the actors. Yes, but not the author. Tolliver designed the last performance, I said. Mallory set the tone. Calvert gave it academic weight. Who else could there be? Holmes closed the journal. That, precisely, is the question that refuses to be answered. He stood suddenly and crossed to his coat. I wish to see Dr. Finch. We found Dr. Silas Finch in his laboratory, hunched once again over his drafting table, surrounded by broken wires, copper molds, and the scattered remnants of candle wax. Though his name had remained clear of formal accusation, he had retreated, nonetheless his reputation charred by proximity. He looked up when we entered, startled. Back again, he asked. Just once more, Holmes replied. To clarify something small but necessary. Finch frowned. I've told you all I know. Holmes nodded. And yet, you've never told me why you built the mirror. Finch blinked. What do you mean? I built it because Elliot asked. No, Holmes said softly. You built it because you understood what it was meant to do. He only gave you diagrams, and yet you delivered a structure of such precision it worked almost perfectly the first time. Finch's expression tightened. I am a physicist, not a philosopher. I understand optics, that's all. Holmes stepped closer. You're also a trained chemist. You handled the resin, though you claimed not to know its properties. You tuned the brass to resonate at a specific frequency, which you wrote off as coincidence. But you see, Dr. Finch Elliot believed in time. Tolliver believed in ritual. Mallory believed in containment. But you believed in application. Finch's hand twitched. You were the one who tested the configuration after Elliot's disappearance. Holmes continued. You told no one. You believed you had glimpsed something greater than theory, something verifiable. And so, you let it grow. You let Tolliver continue. You even let Mallory carry the blame. Finch said nothing. Holmes removed a folded paper from his coat and laid it on the table. I found this in your cabinet drawer. It was a copy of Elliot's final diagram but modified, not in the ring structure, nor the candle alignment, but in the mirror. Finch had annotated its angle with exacting detail, noted tolerances down to the millimeter, and calculated resonance intervals. You were preparing to recreate it, Holmes said, independently, privately. You had no intention of letting the legend die with Elliot. Finch's voice, when it came, was hoarse. He was right. Not about everything, not about time the way he said it, but the rest, the mind, the loop, the binding of memory. I saw it. It worked. Holmes nodded. And so you waited. You fed the illusion while appearing to stand clear of it. A scientist, with clean hands, observing the experiment from a distance. I didn't hurt anyone, Finch said. But you let them, Holmes replied. You let Mallory arrange Elliot's disappearance. You let Calvert turn paranoia into theater. You let Tolliver fall so deeply into the myth, he nearly erased himself. Finch looked down at the diagram. I didn't stop them, he said quietly, because I wanted to see what came next. Holmes said nothing more. He folded the diagram again and turned for the door. Outside, under the rain, we walked in silence. At last I said, will you expose him? Holmes was quiet for some time. Then, no, his influence ends here. He has no audience left, no collaborators, and the mirror, fractured as it is, will never reflect the same illusion again. I turned to him. But why conceal the truth? Holmes's reply was soft. Because in a performance, Watson, it is not the curtain that ends the platers. The applause and silence, in the right moment, is the most damning final act of all. That evening, back in our rooms, Holmes carefully packed Elliot's journal into a small parcel, sealing it with wax and addressing it to the British Library under anonymous donation. Beside it, he placed the cracked mirror, wrapped in linen. These things, he said, belong in stillness now. He sat down, finally lighting his long-neglected pipe. We came here to solve a disappearance, he said. But what we found was far more dangerous a belief, perfectly constructed, a circle of minds feeding each other's certainty, each playing their part so fully they lost sight of the real world. I poured a measure of brandy, and the truth, Holmes smiled faintly. The truth is this, Watson. A mirror is only dangerous if you believe it shows you more than yourself. He exhaled a long breath of smoke, rising in a perfect spiral to the ceiling. Outside, the rain continued, gentle now, like the closing of a chapter too strange to retell. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering 2. Days passed in a hush of mist and echo. The news of Elliot's survival, though kept from the wider press at Holmes's requests, circulated in secret, whispered in stairwells and behind closed office doors. Officially, the college had moved on. The council convened to appoint an interim dean. Tolliver's name was quietly stricken from the student ledger. Mallory awaited trial in London, and Dr. Finch, though not formally accused, tendered his resignation, citing philosophical incompatibility with the direction of institutional inquiry. But for Holmes, the matter was not yet finished. Not entirely. The pieces are no longer scattered, he said, standing by the window in the early morning, but the minds behind them remain unaligned. They each know a different version of the truth. If left as they are, legend will take root. Elliot will become a ghost, again this time not by vanishing, but by multiplication. They must all see the same story, Watson. Only then will it end. You mean to assemble them? Asked Holmes, turned, that gleam of theatrical calculation lighting his eyes. In the observatory, he said, where the mirror first cracked, where the illusion was rehearsed, where perception bent, and Elliot. Holmes shook his head. He cannot come. His mind is not yet his own, but his presence is no longer necessary. We have the ring, the pages, the cracked mirror, the participants, and the final question. That evening, the observatory dome was unlocked for the first time since the second ritual site had been discovered. A single oil lamp hung from the ceiling. The windows had been blacked out. The ring on the floor, once scorched, had been scrubbed clean. Holmes had placed a chair within it, not as a stage, but as a fulcrum. By 7:30, the guests began to arrive. First was Miss Persephone Vale, wrapped in a long coat, her expression guarded but curious. Then Dr. Ambrose Calvert, escorted by a college constable, permitted attendance only under Holmes's personal guarantee. Dr. Finch arrived shortly thereafter, silent and pale, with a single notebook tucked under his arm. Finally, Dean Mallory, released from holding for this singular meeting, was ushered in by an officer from Scotland Yard. He said nothing as he took his seat. Tolliver, of course, was absent. Holmes stood before them, hands clasped behind his back, his voice calm but firm. I thank you all for coming. You are here because you participated, knowingly or otherwise, in a performance that nearly cost a man his mind and a college its memory. Tonight, there will be no accusation, no trial, only illumination. He turned and lit a single candle at the center of the ring. The room flickered. He lifted Elliot's journal. This, he said, is the original manuscript, untouched, annotated only by the author's hand. It outlines a theory not of time, but of perception, how the mind, under precise conditions, may loop upon itself and generate the illusion of dislocation. Elliot's hypothesis was never about science in the conventional sense. It was about experience. But when combined with optics, scent, and suggestion, that experience became indistinguishable from reality. He paused, and so, a trick of the eye became a hole in time, but only because each of you provided the belief necessary to sustain the illusion. He turned to Miss Vale. You offered the ritual language. You framed the theory in myth. Between seconds, you said, light within time. Phrases Elliot repeated, absorbed. You made the trap beautiful. Miss Vale looked away, eyes glistening. He turned to Calvert. You gave it fear. You shouted madness from the rooftops. You ensured no one dared question what they did not understand. In discrediting Elliot, you strengthened the legend. Calvert said nothing. Then, to Finch, you built the body, the mirror, the mount, the candle design. You tested the idea even as you claimed to disbelieve it. You turned theory into tool. Finch's fingers clenched around his notebook. Finally, Holmes turned to Mallory, and you gave it silence. You let it grow unchecked. You believed it dangerous, yes, but rather than confront it, you suppressed it, and in doing so, gave it weight. Mallory exhaled sharply through his nose, but made no reply. Holmes stepped back. Rupert Elliot is alive. He escaped because the mirror was cracked, not physically but symbolically. The sequence was broken. He slipped through the loop because, at the final moment, he forgot to believe in it. The room was utterly still. Now you must forget as well. He reached down and placed the cracked mirror at the foot of the chair. Look into it, he said. See what remains. One by one, each guest approached. Miss Vale saw herself first pale, tired, and alone. She touched the fracture, and her fingers trembled. Calvert saw his reflection split, his face divided by the crack. He blinked rapidly, then stepped away without a word. Finch looked for longer than the others. He squinted, frowned, as if trying to see beyond it. But all he found was himself, and Mallory, once Dean, once untouchable, saw only a man who had tried to bury an idea by cloaking it in myth. His mouth tightened, but still, he said nothing. Holmes turned off the lamp. Only the candle remained. He let the flame burn for a moment, more than snuffed it with a gloved hand. "We are done here," he said. Outside, the sky had cleared, revealing a scatter of stars. Holmes and I walked slowly across the quad, the last few puddles reflecting the shimmer of old gas lamps. "No charges?" I asked quietly. "No," Holmes said. "The college will see to its own. The law cannot prosecute suggestion, nor can it indict belief." He turned to me. "But memory, Watson, memory can be corrected." We stopped by the fountain. "Eliot's work will be published in time," Holmes said. "Stripped of legend, reviewed with skepticism, rescued from mystery, and in doing so, its truth, whatever sliver of it remains, may find form. And the others, they will go on, changed, perhaps cautious, perhaps humbled, or perhaps not." I glanced back toward the observatory, now dark again. "And you?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I am not immune to illusion, Watson. But I know." Longer mistake reflection for revelation. A light wind stirred the trees, rustling through the ivy. Then Holmes added, almost to himself, "A man can vanish in many ways, but the most permanent of all is the one built on understanding. That, Watson, that is the final act." Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. It was 2 nights later, when Holmes, having remained almost entirely silent since the final gathering, announced he would present his full account of the case. We were alone in the sitting room of our temporary quarters, the fire burning low and the faint tick of the mantel clock, marking time like a soft metrome. Holmes stood before the hearth with a single folded sheet of paper in hand, the same he'd carried since the moment Eliot was found in the ruined chapel. "It is a rare thing, Watson," he began, "for a mystery to culminate, not in the revelation of guilt, but in the exposure of belief." I said nothing, sensing what was to follow would not merely be a recitation of facts, but a reassembly of meaning. Holmes began. "The so-called disappearance of Professor Rupert Eliot was not a vanishing in any physical sense. It was a staged cognitive collapse, engineered, executed, and then weaponized. The mechanism was complex, yet elegantly layered. The candle, the mirror, the copper ring all served a singular purpose: to trap the subject's perception in a controlled loop, and while the effect was psychological, the symptoms were real." He turned toward the table, where Eliot's cracked mirror lay like a relic, still split by the spidering fracture down its center. "The illusion began with the candle," Holmes continued. "Not an ordinary beeswax taper, but one infused with a mixture of frankincense, rosemary oil, and silver nitrate, carefully measured to create a subtle disorientation when burned in a closed environment. The scent interacted with the olfactory system, heightening memory recall while gently dulling temporal awareness. The mirror," I interjected, "was used to reflect this disorientation." "Precisely. Its curvature and alloy were tuned to distort light just enough to create a soft duplication of the flame, a ghost image layered atop the real one. When viewed at a specific angle, it gave the impression that time itself had echoed. Combine this with the circular markings beneath the apparatus, and the subconscious is gently led to believe that something fundamental has changed." Holmes retrieved a small brass model from the tabular-scaled replica of the apparatus, constructed from Finch's original plans. "This is what Tolliver completed," he said, "but he did not invent it. The base design was Eliot's obsessive, yes, but sincere. Eliot sought not escape, but insight. He believed that if the mind could be momentarily unmoored from linear progression, one might see into what he called the echoes of now." Holmes paused. "Unfortunately, that ideal was hijacked." He returned to the fire, casting the replica back onto the table with a soft clink. Dean Mallory, fearful of Eliot's growing influence, intervened. First, he denied funding, discouraged publication, and planted seeds of doubt within the faculty, but his motives were political, not malicious. He feared instability, not transformation. Holmes drew a line in the air. Next came Calvert. he transformed doubt into drama. By framing Eliot's ideas as dangerous mysticism, he drew attention away from the actual experiments and onto Eliot himself. The man became the myth. And Finch, I asked. Holmes hesitated. Finch was the pivot, a man of pragmatism, drawn into the web through curiosity. He enabled the design, but kept his distance. His failure was one of omission. And Tolliver, Holmes's eyes sharpened. Tolliver was the believer, the architect of the illusion's climax. He placed the final mirror, he switched the resin, he orchestrated the scene on the night of Eliot's disappearance, but didn't intend to harm him. I added, not intentionally. But ideas, Watson, once weaponized, care not for their wielders. He sat down now, folding his hands. The final trick the one nearly used on me was a repetition of the first, but where Eliot hesitated, I did not. That difference broke the loop. Eliot's mind became unstuck in its own projection, because the illusion required belief, and in the end, belief is never absolute. I frowned. But what of the journal's final page, the one that led us to Eliot? Holmes withdrew it from his pocket. It wasn't written by Eliot at all. I sat upright. What? Compared the pressure, the slope of the hand, subtle deviations but meaningful. It was Tolliver, a master forger by necessity he had been, copying Eliot's annotations for years, to study them. He placed the page beside the journal. He left the note, not for us, but for himself. A map back. He believed that when the illusion completed, he could follow Eliot into whatever realm he thought had been accessed. Holmes exhaled. But illusion is not transportation, Watson. It's reflection. And Tolliver was looking not into time but into himself. He let the words settle like ash. I stared at the fire. And Eliot, recovering, slowly. He may never articulate what he saw, but I believe he saw everything. Every fear, every regret, every unspoken thought looped, until it fractured. We sat in silence for some time. Finally, I said, "You never revealed that publicly." "Why?" Holmes gave me a look that was almost tired. "Because it wouldn't matter. To reveal it would only invite others to chase the same illusion, and this time, someone might not return." He rose. "Let Eliot's myth fade. Let the apparatus be forgotten. Let the mirror crack and remain cracked." Then he added, more softly, "Truth, Watson, is often too fragile to survive performance." I stood as well, uncertain what more could be said. As we extinguished the lamps and prepared for departure, Holmes paused at the threshold of the door. "Come," he said. "Cambridge has had enough of ghosts." And we stepped out into the night, where the rain had lifted and the stars had returned, cold, distant, and silent as ever. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The matter of Rupert Eliot's disappearance, though solved in essence, left behind a trail of complications no verdict could neatly contain. Truth, as Holmes had so often told me, was rarely the bomb the world hoped it would be. It offered clarity but not comfort. And in this case, it brought a kind of quiet reckoning to each of the players involved. Eliot himself was moved under private care to a sanatorium on the outskirts of Sussex. The college, while publicly claiming he had suffered a severe intellectual breakdown, provided for his long-term treatment discreetly and without resistance. I visited him once. Weeks later, his body was improving, but his thoughts drifted between coherence and riddle. He asked me if the sky was always above us or if sometimes, just sometimes, it was remembering a shape we no longer had the eyes to see. He did not speak of the mirror, nor did Holmes. When I returned from the visit, Mallory was tried at a private hearing, stripped of his title, and quietly removed from his position as dean. No formal prison sentence was imposed. He was, however, barred from teaching or publishing again. The college ensured the proceedings were swift and contained. His final address to the council was brief and, by all accounts, devoid of apology. He maintained that he had acted in the interest of institutional stability. Holmes had predicted as much. He mistook silence for order, he said, but silence is not order, it is only delay. Ambrose Calvert returned to Oxford in disgrace. Though not formally prosecuted, his credibility in academic circles was destroyed. Within a month, his lectures were suspended, his papers retracted, and his name spoken only in sideways glances among those who once dined with him. It was whispered he had taken up residence in a boarding house near Canterbury and refused visitors. One report claimed he was working on a manuscript titled The Curse of Thought. Finch, ever the enigmatic figure, left Cambridge by train on a Wednesday morning in early December, his destination unknown. Holmes believed he would surface again, somewhere remote, in some forgotten laboratory, still trying to reproduce the experiment that had nearly fractured a mind. But Finch, for all his faults, had never been cruel or only careless with his wonder. Miss Vale chose to stay at Holmes's suggestion. She was granted limited access to Eliot's remaining papers, with the understanding that her work would be supervised and subject to peer review. She took to the task solemnly, transforming from eager mystic into something far more dangerous, a careful thinker. I believed in the beauty of the unknown, she said to me once, but I never asked what that beauty cost. Tolliver was the most difficult case, though charges of conspiracy were brought against him. Eliot himself, when lucid, refused to testify. Perhaps he saw something in Tolliver that eluded the rest of us, or perhaps, in some warped way, he understood what it meant to chase truth until it blurred into obsession. The court sentenced Tolliver to 2 years in confinement under psychological supervision. Holmes testified on his behalf, emphasizing that the crime was born not of malice but misdirected reverence. Tolliver wept only once when told the mirror had been destroyed, and though Holmes had lied about that, he had locked it away in a lead-lined case beneath the archives. I believed it was the kindest deception he'd ever uttered. And what of Holmes? He did not celebrate that, he rarely did. But that winter, as the case faded from headlines and Cambridge fell back into its rhythms of lectures and debates, I noticed a subtle shift in him. Not a change in method, nor in clarity, but in temperament. He was quieter, more reflective. One night, while we were back at Baker Street, he took from a drawer a small notebook, and opened it, without a word. He read a passage under his breath, then closed the book and placed it back in the drawer, without ever explaining why. It was nearly midnight. The fire was low. The city outside was quiet in the way only a city can be, when it has forgotten what it nearly lost. He turned to me. "Watson," he said, "do you believe we see the world as it is?" I looked up from my own notes. "I'd like to think so." Holmes nodded. "I no longer do." He rose then and crossed to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "I believe we see only the parts that serve our fears or our ambitions." Eliot saw the world as potential. Mallory saw it as danger. Tolliver as proof. And he broke off. "I saw it as a case." He turned to face me. "But it was more than that, wasn't it?" I said nothing. Holmes drew a breath, then smiled faintly. "Still, the pattern has ended. That's something." And he was right. The loop had closed, not because time had bent, but because truth, however flawed, however fragmentary, had been revealed. The mind, when shown its own reflection clearly, cannot look away. The morning after Holmes declared the case concluded, I found a small parcel on my writing desk. Inside was a copper ring etched, smooth, polished to a dull sheen. No note, no name, just the ring. I placed it in my drawer and have never worn it. But sometimes, when I pass a mirror at night and catch a glimpse I don't quite remember taking, I wonder not what I've seen, but who. Chapter 18. Holmes' final reflection. It was on a mild January morning, weeks after the case had been officially closed, that Holmes and I sat again in the familiar sitting room of 221B Baker Street. The fire burned cheerfully, and outside, the city hummed with the quiet resolve of a new year. Rain had washed away the soot from the rooftops, and the bells of St. Dunstan's rang faintly in the distance. Holmes sat at the window, not reading, not writing, but gazing his violin silent. On the chair beside him, untouched since our return from Cambridge, I had come to understand this quiet of his. It was not absence, but contemplation. A slow retreat into thought, where each case left an echo, and each echo either dulled or sharpened him. That morning, I finally asked what had lingered in my mind since the closing of the affair. "Holmes," I said, "do you believe Eliot's theory had merit?" He turned slightly. "You mean, did the mirror truly bend time?" "No," I replied. "I mean, was the experience real?" He considered the question without expression. "Reality, Watson, is not a fixed line. It is a consensus, a pattern, made from overlapping perceptions. If 100 men believe the sun has gone dark, the heat of it matters less than the fear." He rose and crossed to the sideboard, poured himself a measure of brandy, then remained standing. Eliot's achievement was not in discovery, but in construction. He built a window into the unknown, not to travel through it, but to believe in it. and others, each for their own reasons, stepped willingly toward that window. He glanced toward the fire, and it nearly consumed them all. I stirred in my chair. But isn't that what knowledge is? In the end, a flame too close to the curtain. Holmes smiled faintly. Knowledge illuminates, belief burns. He paused. Eliot wanted to witness time. But time, Watson, is not something you see. It is something you feel passing and cannot grasp. What he glimpsed, perhaps, was the mirror of his own intention, and it fractured. He drew from the mantel a small box and opened it. Inside was the broken mirror, cleanly split, sealed in cloth and stored with great care. I have thought of destroying it, he admitted, but I won't. Why not? Because it is the only honest artifact left. It reflects nothing, truly, except the lie that others believed. He set the box down. I've been wondering, I said, why you lied about Eliot's survival, why you told Mallory that he had returned when he hadn't. Holmes looked at me. Because Mallory needed to believe he had failed. It was the only weight heavy enough to tip his pride into confession. But what of the others? They needed a legend broken. I gave them a man returned. That was enough. And Tolliver, Holmes's expression darkened, just slightly. Tolliver believed he had touched something eternal. The mirror was never going to reflect him, it was always going to swallow him. He moved to the window again, drawing aside the curtain just enough to view the pale city skyline. You asked, once, if I thought we see the world as it is, he said. I still don't, but I believe we must try, even if what we find is incomplete. Especially then. He turned to face me, and in that moment I saw in him, not the cold mechanist the world often mistook him for, but something far more human, a man who had stared at illusion long enough to recognize the terrible seduction of understanding. This case, Watson, has taught me more than any I've solved. How so? Because for the first time, I wasn't chasing a crime. He paused. I was chasing an idea. That evening, Holmes wrote a letter, not to Scotland Yard, not to the college, but to Miss Vale. He praised her restraint, her new work, and enclosed a passage from Eliot's journal, one she had never seen. It read, "The future is not written in years, but in moments, and the most dangerous of all is the one we choose to believe without question." He signed it simply. Shit, I asked him, as he sealed the envelope, if he thought she would understand its meaning. I hope, he said, she won't just understand it. I hope she question it. And with that, he returned to the fire. The city dimmed into twilight, its gas lamps flickering like stars caught between memory and invention. I glanced once more at the box on the mantel, sealed, now with thick twine, the mirror within untouched. Will you keep it? I asked. Holmes looked at me with a rare, quiet finality. No, he said. I shall store it in the dark, where all illusions belong. And with that, the matter of the candle that burned a hole in time was closed, not in thunder, nor revelation, but in the one thing that legends fear most, silence.